My name is Michael Zwirling. I'm the proud owner of KSCO News Talk AM 1080 and FM 104.1 in Santa Cruz, California, a place where there are more characters per square inch than anywhere on the planet. It was a lifelong dream for me to own this station from the time I was a high school kid. And in 1991, 25 years ago, I was able to realize that lifelong dream. But be careful what you wish for, because even though I was so passionate about running a radio station that serves the community, we did a very good job of serving the community. But guess what? It didn't pay financially. It was almost impossible to sell enough advertising to pay what it costs to run a radio operation like this. And that's why you won't find a talk radio station anywhere in the country or probably in the world that's anything like KSCO. I'm going to share with you the secret of our success and longevity. For the last 25 years, we have been able to do almost the impossible. And that is because I joined a company called Longevity, founded by Dr. Joel Wallach, an absolutely amazing person. I'm very proud to present the following video presentation that has just blown me away. Dr. Wallach has a message that everybody needs to see, and I want to share it with you starting right now. This is about your health and longevity.
Hello, I'm Dr. Joel Wallach, and we're here to talk about health and longevity today. And the thing that makes my view different is that I have a degree in agriculture. I'm a veterinarian. I wrote the first paper on a mass die-off from pollution in America, 1961. I am a comparative pathologist, and I've done 20,000 autopsies, 17,000 some change, over 454 species of animals and 3,000 humans. This was for the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems, a composite of Washington University, St. Louis, the St. Louis Zoo, and the Shaw's Botanical Gardens. And I also have a degree, a postdoctoral fellowship in comparative pathology, which is the equivalent of a PhD in comparative pathology. And I'm a primary care physician. Since 1982, I've been licensed as a primary care physician and naturopathic physician from Oregon. I've been licensed in Oregon, and I'm also licensed in California, again, as a primary care physician. And of course, this gives me a different view on things. What you're going to see here in this presentation is why we're in trouble. Why our children are going to die before we do. They're going to be the first generation Americans who do not live as long as their parents. Why our food is depleted of nutrients has nothing to do with pollution, and we have a real problem here. And what you're going to find is we're going to give you solutions, and we can all win this game together, but everybody's going to have to be obsessive about making these things happen. So here we go. And of course, you're seeing here some of the various awards I've won. So it gives me a little credibility. And I graduated agricultural school at the University of Missouri. I graduated veterinary school at the University of Missouri. And before graduating veterinary school, I actually started taking courses in pathology. And this is me getting an award at the United Nations for Natural Medicine, Lifetime Achievement Award for Natural Medicine and Philanthropy. And the ambassador on the right side of your picture is this wonderful lady. She's the ambassador from Nepal, and the gentleman on your left is the ambassador from Dubai, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And this is off the stage after receiving the award. This was kind of the red carpet thing. And this is me in 2011 getting the Klaus Schwarz Award for trace mineral research in the prevention and reversal of birth defects. And most of you have heard or read the audio cassette tape, the CD, or the book, Dead Doctors Don't Lie. The CD is in 12 different languages all over the world, and it's sold over 300 million copies. We're very, very proud of that. Obviously, somebody's interested in the message. Now, this is a word cloud, and it's just going to be a brief introduction to some of the concepts we're talking about before we get into the details so you know where we're going. I want you to look in the upper right-hand corner, and you'll notice it says obesity. The prevailing theory for 100 years on obesity has been obesity is caused by eating too much and lack of exercise. Well, we followed that theory for 100 years, and what did we get? We're the #1 obese nation in the world. It's a failed theory. Basically, being overweight and obese is really due to a deficiency of a certain group of nutrients, and if any one of them are missing, you're going to start gaining some weight. There are several of those nutrients in that group. If you're missing them, you're going to weigh 400, 600, 800 pounds. And so obesity can be gotten rid of very quickly, but you have to supplement with these nutrients, and then the cravings, the munchies, the binge eating goes away, very simply. You can lose a half a pound to 2 pounds a day, and we'll talk more about that in detail in a moment. The red rectangle just below obesity has the word Alzheimer's in it. Alzheimer's disease is certainly not caused by eating aluminum or being in contact with aluminum deodorant. We're looking at a disease that's a physician-caused disease. Alzheimer's disease is a physician-caused disease. Not caused by aluminum, absolutely not genetic. It's a simple nutritional deficiency disease driven by doctors telling people to do things, telling their patients to give up cholesterol and saturated fat. It's a cholesterol deficiency. We'll talk more about this in a moment. Then there's cardiovascular disease. This is probably one of the biggest hoaxes because it's proactive. It's, in other words, it was consciously done to sell another product. And this is where Procter & Gamble, to make a long story short, ultimately bought the patents for a substance that was used as a submarine diesel engine lubricant, a smokeless lubricant originally. And after the war, they didn't need it as a submarine diesel engine lubricant anymore. And so Procter & Gamble wound up with it, and they were going to sell it as soap, and they couldn't sell it as soap because people were making their own soap. And they decided to use it as a shortening for cooking, but they had to demonize what Grandma had been using for centuries, and that is lard, butter, cream, and eggs for cooking. And what they did, again, to make a long story short, through Ansel Keys, who was on the board of Procter & Gamble and also on the board of the American Heart Association, he brokered a deal in which the Procter & Gamble gave a $1.7 million grant to the American Heart Association in exchange for an endorsement of this diesel lubricant as a replacement for lard, butter, cream, and demonization of cholesterol and saturated fat. Also, they came up with the idea of the Mediterranean diet to sort of make it more sexy to give those things up, the Mediterranean diet, and it's turned out that these are all false things. We'll talk about that more in a minute in detail. But basically, congestive heart failure, one of the more common causes of heart disease in adults all over the industrialized world, is due to a deficiency of a single vitamin. We've known that for 300 years. It was proposed by a Japanese naval surgeon 300 years ago. Cardiomyopathy heart disease, I'm very familiar with that. It's a deficiency of a single mineral. And you see this resulting in sudden deaths in athletes or sudden deaths in people who do hard physical work. I've actually done 1,700 autopsies on kids under the age of 10 that have died of this one in Qishan province, China. It's a deficiency of a single mineral. It has nothing to do with cholesterol or saturated fat. Then there's coronary artery disease. That has nothing to do with saturated fat or cholesterol. Coronary artery disease, and I said this in 1971 after doing 20,000 autopsies on the big NIH project with the Center for the Center of Disease Control and also for the Center of the Biological Systems. And it's one of those things where this was a joint project between Washington University in St. Louis, the St. Louis Zoo and the Botanical Gardens, Shaw's Botanical Gardens, and Marlin Perkins, and Barry Commoner. Those two guys put this together and brought me back from Africa. I was doing research and conservation work with the white rhino and the African elephant. Came back for 2 years after that project and began to do these autopsies. 17,000 some change of over, 454 species of animals and 3,000 humans. And the 1,200-page book that came out of that is in the Smithsonian Institute. And the bottom line of this finding of this 10-year project was that every animal and every human being who dies of what we would call natural causes dies of a nutritional deficiency disease, not pollution and certainly not genetic. So it was kind of a surprise to everybody, but that's what the study showed, and everybody agreed with the research. And so coronary artery disease, again, is not caused by cholesterol or saturated fat. It's actually caused by inflammation, which was said in that book, which is in the Smithsonian Institute. And it's caused by inflammation, caused by eating inflammatory foods, fried foods, processed meats, oils, yes, oils, and gluten, wheat, barley, rye, and oats. And then there's coronary thrombosis. One of my 9 lawsuits against the FDA in federal court, and we won the ability to say that coronary thrombosis is not caused by cholesterol and saturated fat, but is caused by actually a deficiency of omega-3 essential fatty acids and are a ratio problem between omega-3, 6s, and 9s. Then you jump over to arthritis in the lower left-hand corner, and arthritis, in fact, is simply a multi-mineral and multivitamin deficiency disease. Rheumatoid arthritis has a secondary infection with mycoplasma, a bug that's easily killed in a couple of weeks with an antibiotic called minocycline, a member of the tetracycline family. Then you go straight up from arthritis in this word cloud to diabetes, and diabetes has nothing to do with genetics. It's not a genetically transmitted disease. Type 2 diabetes, which makes up 98% of the diabetic population, is in fact due to a simple deficiency of a single mineral. We've known that for almost 80 years now, and of course this allows us to prevent and support the body's ability to heal itself when you have type 2 diabetes. It's one of those little miracles because an example would be if you have iron deficiency anemia, instead of wanting to just give you an iron supplement to solve the problem, medical doctors want to do a bone marrow transplant. And that's why we have such complicated procedures and treatments for diabetes when it's really a very simple mineral deficiency disease. And of course, in the beginning of time, when human beings began to record things and tell stories into their families so they get messages passed down, they believed that diseases were caused by evil spirits or things up in the universe that they had no control over. And they knew there was infectious disease. They didn't know the word infection, but they knew they were transmitted and they were very dangerous diseases. They put writings on cave walls. And these cave walls in the cave art, they had pictures of shamans treating people with infections and wounds. And then, of course, astrology is where they believed this, and we're talking about physicians now, as well as the patients, believed that people would get sick because they angered gods up in planets. And if they would sacrifice either animals or even their neighbors to these gods, they would be appeased and would look kindly upon them and let them survive through epidemics and plagues, or maybe prevent them from getting disease or allow them to have healthy children. And in more recent times, maybe in the last 500 years, medical doctors got rid of their competition by going to churches and telling them that Grandma Ruthie was healing people with her herbs. It was really God's job to heal people and not this witch. And the church would send out inquisition committees to torture these poor grandmothers into confessing that they were a witch, and then they would burn them at the stake. And so the churches were involved in helping eliminate the competition for doctors. Doctors originally believed, in the last 1,000 years, that diseases were caused by an imbalance of different fluids in the body, the humors they called them, imbalance of the humors. And there was blood and phlegm and urine and yellow bile and black bile. And the way that they would balance them back was to use bloodletting. They put leeches on you, suck blood out, or they would just cut veins on the surface and allow a certain amount of blood to drain out. And of course, physicians killed our first president, George Washington, by bloodletting him when he had a respiratory infection. The first guy to really look at nutritional deficiencies in the Western world was a guy by the name of Schussler. And he was a hospitalist in German hospitals, and when indigent patients would die after months or longer in hospitals, he would cremate the bodies and analyze the minerals in their ashes. And then he would actually compare and relate the different mineral levels in these bodies, in the ashes, with their symptoms. And when people come in with those same symptoms, he would give them those minerals, and he was able to cure many, many people. And these minerals became known as Schussler's cell salts. We're talking about magnesium and phosphorus, sodium, sulfur, silica, calcium, phosphorus, I said, iron, and potassium. All of these things were given, and people would get cured. So Schussler is one of the first ones to point to mineral deficiencies as possible causes of certain diseases. The FDA moved from the 7 food group pyramid to the plate. Now, their mantra has been to the general public to just eat well, you get everything you need, eat plenty of dark fruits and vegetables to get antioxidants, and also eat the 4 food groups. You're going to get everything you need. Don't supplement, you could overdose. And this has been a terrible, terrible, terrible event in humanity's development because, as you will see in a moment, you cannot get everything you need just by eating foods of different colors and eating well. Pharmaceuticals got started with patent medicines, of course. We're talking about Professor Smith's or Dr. Frank's liver tonic, which was usually whiskey that they had homebrewed. And one of the first ones here in America was a German fellow by the name of Baer, actually saw people relieving their pain and their suffering by chewing on white willow bark. And he made an alcohol extract of it, a tincture, if you will, and dried out and got a powder, made a pill out of it, and called it Baer aspirin. Was able to relieve pain. That was one of the first over-the-counter, truly what we would call an over-the-counter drug today. Coca-Cola was also one of the first pharmaceuticals. It was actually cocaine to begin with. It was a cocaine in a liquid form, Coca-Cola. And when it became necessary to pull the cocaine out of it because it became a prescription item, what we have here is they would put caffeine from coffee into the Coca-Cola, and they carbonated it and made it something that everybody could drink in the little drugstores. Before there was Prozac for depression, medical doctors would write prescriptions for cigarettes for depression. And when it became known that smoking tobacco or chewing tobacco increased the risk of lung cancer and mouth cancer, oral cancer, and so forth, everybody sued the tobacco companies, and the medical doctors got a walk. They were writing prescriptions for 30, 40 years for tobacco. They were the ones who were intimately involved in causing lung cancer, but nobody ever sued a doctor for that because everybody went to the deep pockets of the pharmaceutical companies, which were at that time the tobacco companies. Hospitals overcharge people by as much as 1,000% in modern times. 85% of all personal bankruptcies are due to medical bills. 85% of all personal bankruptcies are due to medical bills. It's a very, very scary prospect when you think about it. And most of the debt in America and other industrialized nations comes from medical bills. People think they're getting free medical care, but they're paying $6 a gallon gasoline in taxes to pay for the free medical care. So it's not really free. But it buys a lot of votes to say you're going to give free medical care to people if you vote for me, right? And the reason why this goes on is most people don't go through their statements that come in from the insurance companies. And when the statements come, they just look at the insurance statement, they throw it in the drawer without opening it. And so nobody noticed that hospitals are charging insurance companies $500 for a single rubber glove and so on. And they continue to get away with it. The number of Americans using 5 or more drugs nearly doubles, okay? 59% of American adults are on prescription drugs. 59%. This is very, very scary. This is legal drug dealing is what it amounts to. And of course, most prescription drugs, with the exception of antibiotics, do not cure anything. With the exception of antibiotics, which do cure infections, things like bacterial meningitis, bacterial pneumonia, abscesses, bacterial intestinal infections, and so forth. But other than antibiotics, there's not a single drug that cures anything. They all treat symptoms. They all relieve symptoms. Some of them do a very good job. Some of them have terrible side effects, including death. Death rates rising for middle-aged white Americans. Okay, this just came out, you can see, November 2015. And the death rates were rising for middle-aged white Americans while declining for other wealthy countries and among other races and ethnic groups. The rise appears to be driven by suicide, drugs, and alcohol abuse. But when you look at these people who are committing suicide and who are abusing alcohol and drugs, these are ones who have 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 terrible diseases, degenerative diseases, chronic diseases, making their lives miserable, and none of the drugs they're taking are helping them. They're driven to look for something that's going to give them relief. Here's one guy who kind of overdid it, and he started billing for one patient $5 million a month for drug therapy for cancer they didn't have. Well, he got his hand caught in the cookie jar, put in jail for 175 years. And in fact, many, many, many more doctors should be put on trial for the same problems. When doctors don't know what you have, when they don't know what you have as far as a disease, they say you have an autoimmune disease, your body's attacking itself. That way it takes the responsibility away from them. Gosh, instead of saying, I really don't know, I have to do a little bit of research to find out. In the meantime, I'm going to give you this drug to give you some relief. They never do. They say, oh, you have an autoimmune disease, your body's attacking itself. Not much I can do for you. Or you have a genetic disease. You just have bad genes, there's not much I can do for you. Okay, it's not my fault. Well, let's have a look. CAT scans are linked to cancer because they have as much as 500 chest rays worth of radiation for one CAT scan. Even the government says use them on a limited basis. And in fact, most of the time you shouldn't even use a CAT scan. Harvard Medical School said that 20 years ago. Don't use CAT scans, okay, because of the radiation dangers. They're linked to breast cancer and other forms of death. The mammogram is not a prevention. Repeat that. Mammograms are not prevention. They also have as much as 500 chest x-rays worth of radiation in one mammogram. Why would you do that? Well, I've been going to the same OBGYN for 25 years. I really respect him, and he said I really should get a mammogram, so I did. Women should get 3 and 4 different opinions before they make choices like this. And there's other options. A high-resolution ultrasound would give you the same information without the radiation. Of course, an ultrasound, the doctor might only make $50, where in a mammogram, he might make $1,200. Now, this story in the Japanese newspapers kind of gives you the idea of what's happening here with medical care in all industrialized nations. If you notice, medical care expenses in Japan have increased from 2 trillion yen in 1970, that's 2 trillion yen a year in 1970, to 37 trillion yen a year in 2009. And in 2014, it was actually 40 trillion yen for 1 year, 2014. Well, you want to note that Japanese tax revenues in 2013 totaled, from all tax revenues, the country was 42.3 trillion. So the doctors were paid 40 trillion of that. Only 2.3 trillion was left over to do the business of the government. Now you see why governments are going bankrupt. All governments in the industrialized world are going bankrupt because of the cost of inefficient, dangerous, and ineffective medical care. Genetics is another failed theory of the 20th and 21st century. There's not a single disease that's transmitted genetically. There's not a single disease that is transmitted genetically as birth defects. All birth defects are caused by nutritional deficiency of the embryo. The concept of adults passing on information, whether you're an oak tree or a fish or a human being or a hummingbird or a crocodile, goes back to the days of Charles Darwin. People had noticed these things, but Charles Darwin was the first one to write it down. And his cousin, Francis Galton, really enjoyed what Darwin was saying in his book on the origin of species and began a little sort of pseudoscience called eugenics. And this started the entire world in a race for gathering up territory because everybody wanted to be the master race. Remember, this sort of stuff went on in the 1800s, but Hitler picked it up in the 1930s before the Second World War and took eugenics to a horrible, horrible level in which, I don't know, the Nazis killed over 40 million people who they thought weren't worthy of living, kind of like selection in farm animals. If you have one that doesn't meet your criteria for production or standards of looks, you eat them. Okay, and so he was killing people who didn't meet his standards of the perfect generation. Gregor Mendel Priest was the first one to talk about things like recessive and dominance. He understood that in hybrids. He was a priest, and he found out all this information by studying pea plants and how they worked when you began to hybridize different types of pea plants. Very, very smart guy. 1800s, Louis Pasteur invented the germ theory, and he was a wine chemist, and he invented pasteurization. He would heat wine to prevent it from going to vinegar. And he knew that fermentation then was a biological process. And he also knew, once he looked through the first microscope, which was invented by a Dutch eyeglasses maker, von Leeuwenhoek, he could see yeast actually growing in fermenting wine and beer. And so he knew it was a biological process. He heated it and stopped the process so it didn't go to vinegar. Doctors still at the time believed that the fermentation process was a chemical process, and as a result, when you heated it, it actually went faster, sometimes explosively. 1961, I was able to find, as a graduate student, I had graduated ag school, I'm halfway through veterinary school, and taking graduate courses in pathology, found the first mass die-off in America from pollution, did the research, found out how it happened exactly, tracked all the chemistries, got it published. It was my first publication. I gave a copy to Marlon Perkins, and this is how he was interested in me doing the autopsies in his project for the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems. Again, the founding members were the Washington University of St. Louis Zoological Garden, St. Louis Zoo, and Shaw's Botanical Gardens. Barry Commoner, okay, really a very, very smart fellow when it came to biology, and Marlon Perkins was one of my mentors, and he remembered that paper I had given him on the first mass die-off from pollution. And so I was in Africa working on the White Rhino Conservation Project in the African Elevation. And he sent me a letter inviting me back to work on this project with the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems, be the pathologist on the project, because I had given him this paper on pollution. And they believed that pollution was a basic root cause of diseases of natural causes. And they wanted me to do autopsies in zoo animals that lived in big zoos in the big cities of the United States. And they wanted to use the zoo animals in these big zoos in the United States as the canary in the mine, like the old Welsh coal miners would take canaries down to the mine. And if gases would leak into the mine, the canaries were more sensitive than the men, and they would drop off the perch and die long before the men were in danger, and they could get out safely. And they felt that with big zoos having 400, 500, 600 species of animals, that they could get information before we actually got hurt. And they actually froze bodies and sent them to me from zoos all over North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico for this project. This is the book that came out of it. This book, Disease of Exotic Animals, 1,200 pages, covers 20,000 autopsies, 10 million chemistries, and is in the Smithsonian Institute as a national treasure. I'm very, very proud of that work. All birth defects are caused by nutritional deficiencies during the development of the embryo. The embryo has gone down essentially an assembly line. If anything's missing that's required for the production of cells or tissues or organs, if there's something missing at that appropriate time during the first trimester of pregnancy, guess what? You're going to get a defect because something's going to be missing. By the time 1910, 1920 came along, we knew the chemical analyses, we knew the biochemistry of genes and DNA and RNA, but nobody really knew the physical structure, and so it was kind of delaying genetic engineering because nobody knew the physical structure. Well, in 1953, these two young fellows here, James Watson from the United States and Francis Crick from England, proposed a double helix. And it took 9 years. It went all the way until 1962 before the general science community agreed with him, and they got the Nobel Prize for it. At that time, James Watson was named the director of the Cold Springs Genetic Research Laboratory for the federal government in New York and Manhattan Island. In between 2003 and 2011, the human genome was mapped out. We knew every gene that's found in the human body. And 850 biotech companies were formed and spent trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars looking for screening tests that would alert us early on that a child, say 2 years old, when they're 48 is going to get Parkinson's disease, or when they're 52 are going to get breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, and they could genetically engineer the proper healthy genes, replace the bad genes, and thus eliminate the appearance of the disease later on. That was the whole idea of genetic engineering. Well, inborn errors of metabolism were thought to be genetic because people were born with these diseases, and doctors erroneously, falsely believed that they were due to genes, genetics. One of the more common ones is sickle cell anemia, primarily found in the black community as sickle cell anemia. And I was finding sickle cell anemia in deer and in antelopes and in hummingbirds. And how could a human genetic disease wind up in these animals? And so that was my question. And it turns out that this is not a genetically transmitted disease. It's called an inborn error metabolism. During early pregnancy, the 3rd to the 7th week of pregnancy, mother's missing a mineral. And what happens is the system that manufactures good hemoglobin is not correct because things were missing when it was forming. And so you get a dysfunctional hemoglobin, and under not so optimal circumstances, it will sickle. And they'll have a crisis and certainly can die from it. Now, this is in the black community. In the white community, the same disease is called thalassemia. And they call it thalassemia because you can't have a black gene in a white guy or a white gene in a black guy, so they call the same disease in two different groups, two different names. I always thought that was kind of interesting, and it began to fill in the blanks for me as a researcher doing all these autopsies. Same thing with lactose intolerance. The lactase enzyme, which is formed in the pancreas and the upper small intestine, the mechanisms for forming that enzymes are dysfunctional because mama was missing a mineral when that was forming, and so the equipment doesn't work after the baby's born. But you can supplement a lactase enzyme capsule before you go to an ice cream party. You won't be uncomfortable and embarrass yourself and so forth. Totally preventable. Same way with type 1 diabetes. It's not genetic. Type 1 diabetes is an inborn error metabolism. You're supposed to have something like 500,000 beta cells in an islet of Langerhans in which your body makes insulin. But when kids are born with type 1 diabetes, they might only have, say, 50 or 100 of these beta cells, and they have just enough insulin to squeak by when they're 3, 6, 8, 10, 12 years old, but they're going through puberty at 10 to 12. They're starting to do more physical activities, and it's not enough insulin, and so they show up as a type 1 diabetic at that point. Totally preventable, and certainly at this point, not reversible. Lipid storage disease, there's enzymes missing. What happens is as a person grows older, they get mental diseases because they're missing the enzymes that are required to move fats into cells and out of cells. So what do we have left here? Well, eugenics, of course, was Francis Galton's way of looking at it, but it's really epigenetics. Epigenetics is a science that takes the place of genetics. And notice the subtitle in the book, Epigenetics, is The Death of the Genetic Theory of Disease Transmission. That's based on facts, as you'll see here in a moment, and Black Gene Lies. Pastor Creflo Dollar from Atlanta, Georgia, and the World Changers Church, because I had helped his daughter get rid of a lifelong, terrible form of asthma, and he was told it was genetic in the black community. He was told that his daughter was not doing very well, and she was not going to make it. She wasn't responding to various medications that normally would help other kids with asthma. And so when it was said that she wasn't responding to medication, I knew immediately that she wasn't absorbing the medications, why she wasn't responding. So we put her on a gluten-free diet to increase her efficiency of absorption, got her in the 90 essential nutrients, and her asthma went away in 2 weeks because we were giving her the raw materials, and she was able to absorb the raw materials for her body to make all the various hormones that are necessary to dilate the bronchi. Okay, we were able to support and promote maintenance and repairs of that system. Well, he actually funded the first 100,000 copies of this book, Black Gene Lies. He said, Doc, I want you to get information, do the research, and find all the diseases that are said to be genetic in the black community: diabetes, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and sickle cell anemia, and find out what's going on here and which diseases are genetic, which ones aren't, what we can do to prevent the ones that aren't, and how to cure the ones we can. And of course, all this information is in the book Black Gene Lies. High blood pressure is not genetic, even in the black population. High blood pressure is usually due to a simple mineral deficiency, or maybe when you have kidney failure, the kidneys will release a hormone called renin, R-E-N-I-N, to drive your blood pressure up to try and get more dirty blood into the filtering units. But it certainly is not a genetic thing, totally preventable, and in most cases reversible with a proper supplement program. The death of genetic theory of disease transmission. Now, James Watson, the director of the Cold Springs Genetic Research Laboratory in New York and in Manhattan Island, did not coin that phrase. I coined that phrase. Okay, but he did say that all the experiments they had done over the last 60 years in genetics had been irrelevant. You could actually, I'm quoting him now, you could actually sequence the genes of 150,000 people a day who had diseases we believed were genetically transmitted diseases, things like cancer, diabetes, sickle cell anemia, and the reason why we weren't able to deal with them was because they were genetic. Well, he said all that was irrelevant because none of those diseases are genetic. They're either a chemical problem, a chemistry problem, biochemistry problem, aka nutritional deficiencies. And I then, after he said that in public, I coined the term the death of the genetic theory of disease transmission. Remember, there's thousands of failed medical theories every century, and the 20th century and the 21st century are no different. One of the failed theories in the 20th century and 21st century is that genetics cause disease. It's not true. You can see how a human embryo develops, and if anything's missing along the way, something's wrong with the liver. They get a cleft palate, they get cerebral palsy, they get spina bifida, they get Down syndrome, all nutritional deficiencies as the embryo develops. Totally preventable in many cases, such as cystic fibrosis and muscular dystrophy. Even after the baby is born, they're reversible with supplementation because they're a biochemical problem, not a mechanical, physical problem. One of the places that doctors do good work is saving premiums. 100 years ago, a baby born a pound and a half, most of them didn't make it. Today, maybe 85, 90% will make it. But those 2 and 3 months in the incubators with special care is not cheap. It costs $280,000 to $500,000 per baby, whether they make it or not. And guess what? For $600 worth of supplements, you can prevent preemies. You can prevent all birth defects in babies. Down syndrome is actually caused by a deficiency of a single mineral. We've learned this in animals, and we've eliminated it in animals. And of course, 1 out of 700 babies in America are born with Down syndrome. I've been able to actually prevent and reverse Down syndrome in an embryo. The most famous one in 2.5 months of pregnancy was Lauren Knievel. Eva Knievel was a niece-in-law, and she called me, and she had an amniocentesis, and she had an ultrasound, both of which said she had a very severely afflicted Down syndrome baby. Everybody wanted her to have an abortion. She didn't want to do that. She contacted me and asked if I could help her. We gave her the 90 essential nutrients, 16 minerals, 16 vitamins, 12 essential amino acids, 3 fatty acids. Gave her a little bit extra of the mineral that's missing when you have Down syndrome, and guess what? After 9-month full-term pregnancy, her baby was born perfectly normal. Now, I've done this many times since, but obviously that's the most famous family I've been dealing with, trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. Cerebral palsy is a good example of a gradient disease. Depending on how severe the deficiencies are during the development of the cerebellum, the part of the brain that actually functions to control and stimulate proper function of fine muscles, small muscles. And if you're born with a cerebellum that's the size of a tangerine, all the pieces are there, you're going to be born normal. But let's say you're born with a 10% underdevelopment. You're going to walk like Charlie Chaplin, but that might be manageable and controllable with braces and physical therapy. Let's say you're 25% underdeveloped of your cerebellum. You're going to be flopping around with your arms and legs. What's going to happen here is you will look like a classic cerebral palsy patient. If you're 50% underdeveloped, you're going to be with a wheelchair for the rest of your life because there's not enough size and function of the cerebellum to actually do the mechanical things you need for muscle function. This girl here has as much as a 90% underdeveloped, and the only thing that she could voluntarily move herself are her eyes. You notice the clamps holding her head up. You notice the shoulder clamps and harnesses holding her chest back in the chair. You can see where her legs are shackled into the chair because she had such terrible cerebral palsy that she is flopping all over like a fish out of water, and she had to be restrained in this way. This child costs $5 million a year to care for. Requires an enormous amount of care. Now, the interesting thing about this child, when she goes through puberty and cycles and gets married and has kids, she can have perfectly normal kids, even if her spouse, even if her husband has, yes, cerebral palsy, because it's not a genetic disease. They can have normal babies if they're getting all the 90 essential nutrients prior to conception. Of course, the cerebellum, the part of the brain that looks like a pomegranate has been cut through in the backside of the brain stem, there in this picture. This is the part of the brain that's afflicted when you have cerebral palsy. The smaller it is, the more severe the cerebral palsy. There's another one of my lawsuits against the FDA and federal court, and basically what you see here is two little kids, newborns, with spina bifida. And of course, spina bifida oftentimes occurs in the lumbar area, but can occur anywhere up and down the spine. The one on the right also has a zinc deficiency. It has club feet. Spina bifida is due to a folic acid deficiency, and I'm one of the three guys. We got together and actually sued the FDA, and that's why we have folic acid in prenatal vitamins to prevent spina bifida. Siamese twins are co-joined at the pelvis. These things are all caused by nutritional deficiencies during pregnancy. Here's really incomplete Siamese triplets. You see 3 sets of legs there. The complete child also has a clubbed right foot, meaning a zinc deficiency. The incomplete other part of the triplets here are just from the hips down. So you see 3 sets of legs, but the only complete child is the one bigger one you see. And all this is certainly preventable by proper supplementation prior to conception, all 90 essential nutrients. Congenital deafness is caused by deficiency of a single mineral. It's not genetic in any way, shape, or form. And doctors continue to form agencies and programs to beg for money to find out the gene so kids won't be born deaf. If the mother takes the prenatal vitamins, preconception vitamins, and minerals prior to conception, there won't be any more children born deaf because it's a simple mineral deficiency, a single mineral deficiency. Same way with cleft palate, cleft lip, totally caused by a deficiency of a single mineral in the early stages of pregnancy when the flat disc of the embryo begins to curl up into a tube, and the tube doesn't close all at once, it closes like a zipper, so you can have a defect anywhere along the underside of that embryo, and of course this is the last stages of closing the embryo, and the zipper is the mouth and the palate. The middle and the left-hand picture are babies that have been egregiously impacted by thalidomide, a drug that was given to women for morning sickness early in pregnancy, and it interfered with zinc metabolism in the embryos and caused the loss and prevention of the production of limbs, arms and legs. A terrible, terrible thing. There's a similar thing goes on in a village in Russia where about an average of 300 kids are born there every year in this one village. Half of them have the same defect on both sides of their body. 25% have the defect on the right side, 25% have the defect on their left side. They don't have thalidomide, but they do have a deficiency of that same mineral. And you can see where these kids were gathered together by the photographer to show they all had missing left forearms. Cute little kids, but they're all missing their left forearms. Totally preventable, while the doctors are telling them it's a genetic disease in that community. You've all heard of the Greek mythology of the Cyclops, evil giant. And here's a cycloptic kitten. Here's a cycloptic lamb. Here's a cycloptic shark. And what this tells you is when you have 3 different species here having the same problem, the same deficiency will cause cycloptic anatomy in all vertebrates. Any vertebrate that has a deficiency of this nutrient at that particular moment of the development of the embryo will wind up cycloptic, including humans. And so this is why we had that Greek mythology. There were babies born in those days with cycloptic eyes, as there is today. There's a human baby with cyclops. You can see that there's no nose between the eyes and the upper lip. The nose is above the eye. And of course, this is a very, very terrible birth defect. And most of the time when they do an ultrasound and they see this defect, the parents choose to do an abortion. Many of miscarriages are because these have low viability, these babies with a cycloptic defect, and they will be miscarried. And so I don't know what the percentage is, but it's very high of miscarried babies are cycloptic babies. When you look at animals, where we have control, not wild animals. We don't know the rate in wild animals, but in domestic animals, we have farm animals and pet animals, is 1 in 16,000 have cycloptic anatomy. In humans, when you take in the miscarriages, is 1 in 250. Why is that? Well, that's because we supplement animals to prevent birth defects, and in human beings, you're just told to eat well. Most women will miss 2 periods before they start taking prenatal vitamins. By that time, the embryo is impacted. This single mother had 1 child born with 38 birth defects. 1 child with 38 birth defects. We're talking about spina bifida, heart defects, clubbed limbs, cerebral palsy, and she gets help financially from 38 different agencies that raises money to do research on these things. Somebody needs to go to jail here, and I would vote for the OB/GYN that managed that pregnancy. In 1977, I discovered the first non-human case of cystic fibrosis in a monkey at the Yerkes Primate Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And this was at Emory University, Grady Memorial Hospital. All the experts on their letterhead agreed that the tissues were, in fact, cystic fibrosis. Then I told them it was from a non-human, a monkey, and they were all excited. Said, "Oh, we can have a laboratory animal now. We can study cystic fibrosis." Well, having already done by this time all this research with the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems, Marlin Perkins, Washington University, the St. Louis Zoo, Shaw's Botanical Gardens, written 75 scientific papers, I knew what to look for and began to look for what might cause this birth defect. And everybody said it was genetic. Well, I found that it was due to a deficiency of a single mineral. Deficiency of a single mineral. Was able to go back into the colony where this baby monkey was being raised for NASA for space projects. There were 24 unrelated monkeys, baby monkeys, the same age that still were alive, but they had the disease. Got permission to do biopsies of their pancreases and livers and lungs, and sure enough, they all had cystic fibrosis. They were not related genetically in any way, shape, or form. Gave them the mineral that was missing and cured them all. Wrote it up. Asked for permission to get it published, and I was fired from Emory University and Yerkes Primate Center. I said, "Wallach, you must be sniffing glue. Everybody knows that cystic fibrosis is genetically transmitted." I said, "Well, why don't you call together a committee like you would for challenging a thesis for a PhD student? Get geneticists, get experts in cystic fibrosis, get pediatricians, and let them challenge my evidence. Let me bring my evidence and respond to them. If I can satisfy them, and they're all agreed, then we can move forward and get grants and save kids. But if we can't, then go ahead and fire me." They said, "No, we'd be embarrassed to tears to call together such a committee because everybody knows that it's genetically transmitted." And this is the press release from Emory University in March of 1978 when they knew that we had a non-human case of cystic fibrosis. They were very excited about it, and they wanted to get credit for it, so they sent out this positive news release. And then they fired me in another month when I told them it wasn't genetic. Okay, well, this is from June of 2005. June of 2005, the International Laboratory Animal Research Journal. You notice it says serendipitous insights involving non-human primates. This was the entire journal. This issue was dealing with primate research and human diseases because at this time the federal government had actually defunded primate research. It's too expensive, $1,000 a day for primates. Use mice is only 10 cents a day. If you have to use primates, go to the Gates Foundation, get money from them. The government's not going to pay for it. And so they took the top 10 serendipitous findings, the top 10 accidental findings in primate research that benefited humanity so well, said, look, even just by accident we found these things. And number 2 out of the top 10 for the 20th century was the discovery of the first non-human case of cystic fibrosis, my work. And there was like 3 paragraphs in that piece on the cystic fibrosis. And the last sentence, the last portion of that sentence, they had brackets and said, and Emory University refused to release the name of the young pathologist who made the discovery, close brackets, because they were so embarrassed that they had fired me. And now they were using my work to try and save their research programs. One of the reasons why they didn't want it to be a simple nutritional deficiency disease, because the yearly cost just for the respiratory piece of cystic fibrosis, and there was a digestive piece also, and liver piece also, but for just the respiratory piece, the cost for one patient is almost $260,000 a year. So why do they want to give up that kind of income just by telling the truth? And this is why the medical system tends to fail us, is because they work for the money as opposed to the truth. These are some of the kids that I deal with cystic fibrosis. Little Sydney Myers from Fort Wayne, Indiana. She was supposed to have a double lung transplant, 2.5 years of age. Her parents didn't have insurance, didn't have money, and so they came to me and we put her on the program. And here she is 6.5 years later winning a dance contest. And of course she's perfectly normal at this time and she'll be able to have normal babies and no problem. Now, an opportunity came along in 1989 for me to go to Qishan Province, China. I went to Qishan Province, China to do autopsies on kids that died of Qishan's disease, which is a deficiency of a single mineral. Now, the same mineral is the same deficiency that causes cystic fibrosis. Now, that's not unusual. People say, well, you must be infatuated with that mineral. No. Calcium deficiency can result in 147 different diseases. Zinc deficiency is a big, big cause of many different birth defects. And so this mineral deficiency, selenium, is no different. There's probably 25 different diseases caused by selenium deficiency. Well, Qishan disease, as it's called, is named after the province in China where it occurs so frequently because there's little or no of this mineral selenium in the soil there. Plants that they grow, corn and wheat, don't require selenium. And when these poor farm kids eat these grains, they get plenty of calories, maybe a little protein, but they don't get any of this mineral. And thousands of them die every month. There's over 300 million people in that one state. There's over 300 million people in those provinces. So when a couple of thousand kids die every month, it's a serious problem, obviously, but it's not like it's an epidemic going through and killing millions and so per month. And so this is one of those things where they just sort of learned to live with it. They would supplement these kids with selenium, and they saved many of them by doing that. So I went there and I said, if I'm correct, and cystic fibrosis is caused by congenital selenium deficiency, by a deficiency of selenium during pregnancy, then some of these kids in China and Qishan province are going to have cystic fibrosis. And I took that thought to people who were geneticists and people who were experts in cystic fibrosis, and they laughed at me again. They said, well, now we know why you got fired. You're really dumb because Chinese kids don't get cystic fibrosis. I said, really? I've autopsied these Oriental kids and black kids that had cystic fibrosis. And I went to China, did 1,700 autopsies. 1,700 autopsies in this program. And I was hoping for 1 or 3 or 5 or something like that, kids with cystic fibrosis. Well, it turns out that 35%, 595 of them had cystic fibrosis out of the 1,700. There was unimpeachable evidence. The slides are still there in the universities where the work was done. It can be tracked. We can redo the study again. We'll have the same result, I guarantee you that. Sent copies of this published in English, published in Chinese, in peer-review refereed scientific journals. And guess what? Sent them to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Never had a response. They should have their nonprofit status taken away from them because every child that's born with cystic fibrosis or dies of cystic fibrosis is on their head. Somebody needs to go to jail, okay? Well, I got a 3 when I did those 1,700 autopsies because they also found out the cause, prevention, and cure for muscular dystrophy. Worked on that for years. Actually worked with the Amish communities, which have a very high rate of muscular dystrophy. And guess what? We were able to support and promote maintenance repair, reverse muscular dystrophy. Even their own doctors said it was reversed. Gave Jerry Lewis from the Muscular Dystrophy Foundation copies of many of these kids' reports and their records, showing even their doctors said they had had their muscular dystrophy reversed. He took it to the Muscular Dystrophy Foundation, and they fired Jerry Lewis for insisting that they look at this seriously. They fired Jerry Lewis. Again, I believe they should have their tax-exempt status taken away from them because every time a kid is born with muscular dystrophy or dies from it, it's on their heads. Somebody needs to go to jail. Cardiovascular disease, we've already talked about this briefly. Congestive heart failure, deficiency of a single vitamin. Cardiomyopathy heart disease. Qishan disease is a deficiency of a single mineral. Coronary artery disease is caused by inflammation, eating fried foods, processed meats, oils, microwave popcorn, all that kind of stuff. And then coronary thrombosis is caused by an omega-3 essential fatty acid deficiency. None of these cardiovascular diseases is caused by what? Cholesterol or saturated fat. It was a sales campaign to sell Crisco. Remember, Procter & Gamble gave the American Heart Association, brokered by Ansel Keys, $1.7 million to endorse Crisco and demonize cholesterol. Records show now that the heart age of most people in the industrialized world, including America, are older than their chronological age. In men, it's 7.8 years older, and women, 5.6 years older. That's because of the eating of trans fats and heterocyclic amines, which cause particular inflammation in the coronary arteries and cause heart disease. And this just shows you a map what part of the continental United States and the islands of Hawaii and Alaska have the highest rates of heart ages that are far older than their chronological age. Here's one of the bad boys when it comes to cardiovascular disease, microwave popcorn. We're seeing more and more kids, we're talking about 8, 10-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 2-year-olds dying of heart disease, coronary artery disease, because what? Oh, they're being babysat with Microwave popcorn. You know, the parents can't afford babysitters, so they give them a bag of microwave popcorn and let them watch TV or put on a giggly cartoon movie while they're doing work in the kitchen. And these kids are dead by the time they're in their teens and early 20s. Microwave popcorn contributes to 50,000 heart attacks a year, 20,000 deaths. Front page story in the USA Today. Now, the new Crisco, of course, again demonized by the American Heart Association in exchange for $1.7 million. Procter & Gamble always trying to expand their market. And what they wanted to do was have you deep fry your Thanksgiving turkey in Crisco instead of roasting it, like we've done traditionally since the days of the Revolution. The new Crisco, made to help take the fat worry out of good eating. Well, who put the fat worry into it? The American Heart Association, by demonizing cholesterol and saturated fat. And of course, all this story came from 2 full pages of the New York Times. And basically, we're talking about saturated fat does not cause heart disease. Okay? And of course, this goes back to Dr. Ansel Keys again. He was, through his force of will, I mean, this guy was one of these bombastic guys. He could pound on the podium and yell and scream, and people believed him because he was so forceful, and he drove the use of Crisco rather than milk and cream and butter and eggs and lard. Now, in addition to demonizing cholesterol and saturated fat, they actually looked at making it sexier to use Crisco, and so they looked at the Isle of Crete and came up with a Mediterranean diet. In fact, the Mediterranean diet was a fraud. It was a sales campaign to sell Crisco. There was no evidence to back up any of the claims for the Mediterranean diet. Fried foods, trans fats, cause stroke. They contribute to the inflammation of arteries that cause stroke. If you're deficient in omega-3s and you're eating a lot of fried foods, you're going to get a stroke, even if you're 2 years old, even if you're 6 months old. Kishan province in the red here, selenium-depleted red area. Now, you've all heard of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And of course, another failed theory was doctors said that SIDS was caused by the baby sleeping on their back. What a dumb theory that was. They didn't use the special stains to see if the SIDS was caused by heart disease. In fact, these kids that died of SIDS when they're 2 months old, 2 weeks old, was caused by a deficiency of selenium. It was Kishan's disease. I did the special stains because I'm a pathologist that looks at those details. And so we actually sued the FDA for many years trying to get selenium into prenatal formulas and also into infant formulas after the baby's born. And we had a big fight. They didn't like the idea that this might deal with genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy. So when we talked about SIDS, they signed off on that one. They signed off on that one. Let us put it in infant formulas. In fact, it's required. Selenium is now required in infant formulas to deal with SIDS. But through the back door, we're also going to eliminate muscular dystrophy and cystic fibrosis because it'll also deal with that. So we had to do little surreptitious things there and go through the back door to get a threefer. And these are the sort of kids that would die from Kishan disease from a selenium deficiency because they lived entirely on wheat and corn in a place that had little or no selenium in the soil. Dr. Fred Kern, professor of medicine at the University of Colorado, was training a bunch of newly graduated medical doctors on how to examine seniors. And he found this chart of an 88-year-old guy. He says, come on, let's go examine this guy. Goes in the examining room and he looks at him. He says, is this you? He points to the chart and says, is this you? Yeah. He says, the chart here says you're 88 years old. You don't look that old. He says, yeah, people say I look like I'm 50. And he says, well, what do you attribute your youthful looks to when you're 88 years old? And he said, I eat 25 eggs a day. I've been doing it for 17 years. I'm going to do it for another 100 years. Well, of course, this is not what Dr. Kern was looking for in front of these students. And I didn't say it in the article, but I guarantee you, he sat down, he's fanning himself with his clipboard. He said, okay, sir, why are you eating 25 eggs a day? And the guy stands up, throws his chest out, throws his shoulders back and said, because it makes me more studly. Now, you think about that. When you look at testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, adrenal hormones, they're all steroid hormones, and they're 95% by weight cholesterol. They're 95% by weight cholesterol. You want a cholesterol-restricted diet, and you're taking statin drugs to lower your cholesterol, there's nobody home anymore. You get erectile dysfunction, low T. Women go into menopause when they're 35 years old and start getting hot flashes and night sweats, and they stop cycling when they're 35, 40 years old because they're not making enough hormones. You get adrenal exhaustion. But even more importantly than all that, we had a new disease, a new big boy disease called Alzheimer's disease. 45 years ago, Alzheimer's disease didn't exist, even by another name. Today, it's the number 4 killer of adults over the age of 65. It's driven. It's a physician-caused disease. 75% of the human brain weight is the white matter of the brain, the myelin. It's called myelin. It's the insulation material of the brain. And this myelin that makes up 75% of your brain weight is 100% cholesterol. So you go on a cholesterol-restricted diet, no more cholesterol in your blood, or very little because you're getting it down to like 100 with statin drugs, you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. It's an Alzheimer's disease is a preventable disease. It's a reversible disease. And this is the entire story of saturated fat and cholesterol in Time magazine. I want you to look at Ansel Keys on the left part of your screen. And Ansel Keys here, I mean, he even looks like a Nazi. He was actually put on the cover of Time magazine as the hero who saved the American cardiovascular system by identifying cholesterol and saturated fat as the evil ones. He was the one that demonized them. Cholesterol on the front page of Time magazine, and this is the sort of way, this is the method they use to demonize cholesterol. On your right-hand part of your screen, Time magazine, Eat Butter, big scoop of butter on the cover, and this is a article, obviously a cover story, 5 pages, talks about the story with Ansel Keys and how he got Procter & Gamble to endorse a diesel engine submarine lubricant for cooking as opposed to butter, cream, lard, and eggs. In this one on the right-hand side, Time magazine, Eat Butter, this is from June 23, 2014. It says, scientists labeled saturated fat the enemy and why they were wrong. You need to read that one, and you'll realize how badly you've been defrauded by the medical system and the pharmaceutical industry. The individuals on Earth, the culture on Earth that has the fewest cardiovascular events are the Inuit Eskimos above the Arctic Circle. No less than a dozen times a year, there's articles printed in scientific journals on these peoples. And they're kind of unique. They just don't get cardiovascular disease. And yet, 98% of their traditional diet above the Arctic Circle is red meat and fat. They eat nothing but whale meat and whale blubber, walrus meat and walrus blubber, seal meat and seal blubber, bear meat and bear fat. They don't eat vegetables or fruit. They don't eat nuts and grain. Their cholesterols run 350 to 500. They don't get cardiovascular disease until they come down into the lower 48 and eat like us. Salt is not bad. Salt has 2 essential nutrients in it, sodium and chloride, required for all kinds of chemical reactions inside cells. Can't live without sodium and chloride. And of course, chlorine is also required to make stomach acid to keep your stomach sterile, to help pepsin, the enzyme, digest proteins, amino acids, and help the Castle's intrinsic factor to absorb B12. Also, to absorb most minerals, you're going to require stomach acid. You're going to get reflux if you don't have enough stomach acid to keep your stomach sterile, because yeast and bacteria will grow in there. And so you need stomach acid to keep your stomach sterile. Anybody who tells you to restrict your salt because of high blood pressure should be put in jail. Somebody needs to go to jail here. 1982, salt, a new villain. 2014, salt doesn't cause high blood pressure. This shows you death rates, okay, from heart disease. And then, of course, in February of 2012, the FDA sent an urgent stop email to all licensed medical doctors in America. It says, stop writing prescription for statin drugs, Lipitor, Zocor, Mevacor, Levostatin, these kinds of things. And they listed them on that email. Stop writing prescriptions for these drugs. Stop telling your patients to get on cholesterol-restricted diets. Because if you continue to do this, you're going to increase the risk of type 2 diabetes by 52% and Alzheimer's disease by 100%. 4 months later, Science News, June of 2012, good cholesterol not so beneficial. Wait a minute, your doctor says it's everything. Of course, they say it's not beneficial. And then they went on to say that higher HDL, high-density lipoprotein, the good cholesterol, high good cholesterol levels don't reduce the rate of heart disease or heart attacks. Why is that? Because no heart disease is caused by cholesterol or saturated fat. Remember, congestive heart failure is caused by deficiency of a single vitamin. Cardiomyopathy heart disease is caused by deficiency of a single mineral. Coronary artery disease is caused by inflammation. And thrombotic heart disease, coronary thrombosis, blood clot in the coronary artery or brain artery, is caused not by cholesterol and saturated fat, but an omega-3 essential fatty acid deficiency. Margarine is the worst type of fat for the heart. And this includes the margarine that's in between the chocolate cookies and Oreo cookies. And here's the front cover story, FDA to trim trans fats out of food. And I thought they were too lenient on the people who had trans fats in their foods they manufactured. They gave them 3 months to do it, and that's 90 days. When you have so many thousands of people dying from this, and our young kids dying from this, somebody needs to go to jail. Let's look at athletes real quickly. Exercise is thought to be a very, very good thing. It can be, if done properly. But let's look at professional athletes, look at amateur athletes, and let's look at their average lifespan. Let's look at how long they live. Jim Fixx, the darling in the medical world, because he said you don't have to supplement. All you have to do is run, and you'll keep your arteries clean. He died at 52 while he was running. His protege, his top student, Brian Maxwell from Canada, died at age 51 while running. He had 12 gold medals in long distance running, 3 of which were in the Olympics.